Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about my problems with trans-exclusionary radical feminism, or TERF. This is a subcategory of feminism which is building off of radical feminists' desire to supplant or supersede gender altogether, that feminism's goal should be to ultimately surpass gender, since it is a construct. But trans-exclusionary radical feminists think that in order to do this, trans people cannot be part of the feminist movement. They cannot take part in the identity category of woman. And there are a number of reasons why TERFs will hold this. And in this lecture, I want to talk about some of them. And I want to talk about the misstep in general of gender essentialism that I see as pervading TERF discourse, and that I see as really being antithetical to the goals of radical feminism to surpass gender and its oppressive hierarchies and associated techniques of oppression. Now, there are a couple of building blocks that I think we need to address first if we want to really understand the implications of trans-exclusionary radical feminism and therefore some of its theoretical underpinnings. The first of which is a general accepted fact in feminist discourse, which is that gender is a social construct. That it is not some biologically determined necessity or essence, and that it is not reducible to the facticity of bodies. It is negotiated in a whole other social sphere of practices, of techniques, and it is reinforced through power relations, right? So acts are used to subdue certain people and to elevate others in order to regulate this social category and therefore this concept of gender, of what it means to be masculine or feminine, male or female. And this question of meaning is important because this means that there will always be a stochastic interplay of the system basically reacting to the outputs that are formed, the ways that people build practices and behaviors as a way to respond to and co-opt these categories. The system is basically always trying to rewrite itself in order to exclude certain members which are seen as a threat to these concepts' legitimacy or holism, and then, of course, to privilege other ones that are seen as upholding certain status quos which are always going to be related to power, right? They're going to serve the powerful. So that's our first step. Next is this idea of who gets to belong in the feminist movement. Because the feminist movement is on the one hand concerned with elevating women, with the equality of the sexes. And yet, on the other hand, radical feminism takes this a step further and says that our goal should be to abolish gender altogether. That because gender is a construct, it can and should be superseded because it brings with it these hierarchies by necessity. And this is something that Judith Butler talks about, that if we want to talk about there being a subject of feminism, that is, woman, properly speaking, who would ground who gets to count as legitimate subjects, we paradoxically undercut our capacity for our women's movement to represent women precisely because the notion of a subject of feminism requires certain marginalized groups that could be considered feminine or not as being excluded just out of the nature of the way the identity works. Identity is both a question of inclusion, of who is in the group, and also exclusion, who is not in the group. Therefore, you have this binary of in-group and out-group, but also within the in-group, there is a sort of sub-marginalization that goes on, where certain people are, we don't really know what to do with them. They're kind of in the group, but they're kind of not. They're kind of a threat. And this is one of the ways that trans-exclusionary radical feminists don't want to accept trans people into the women's movement because it is seen as one of these internal threats to the in-group, one of these marginal edge cases that threatens the stability of the women's movement on both a theoretical and a practical level, right? That if feminism is grounded in some notion of women, it therefore begs the question of some common elements of women and some notion of the female experience, for example. And so the TERFs will argue trans people don't have this experience. They've grown up being misgendered and whatnot, and not being socialized in accordance with the gender which they actually are, which is, right, a trans woman. And because they take that transition later in life, it can vary depending on when someone does transition, they are, to a greater or lesser extent, not participating in the womanly experience or the female experience the same way that cisgender women are. And the argument goes that this is an affront to the women's movement because it fractures it internally. It threatens the stability and the longevity of a movement. And on a practical case, I'm not really sure. This seems like this would be an empirical question, to what extent a group can allow for a certain amount of fragmentation, right? Can tolerate this difference. But Judith Butler wants to argue that this is also something we need to address theoretically. How can we create a discourse that can allow for difference and not treat every difference like it is an affront to the subject of feminism, namely women itself? And Judith Butler is going to argue, well, we shouldn't be essentialist about our women's movement because this takes for granted the existence of gender. It begs the question that there is such thing as a solid category of women against which we can build a solid women's movement. And we have to realize, of course, that the TERFs are also approaching this from a question of, well, if we want to get rid of gender, then why are we supporting gender categories at all? Therefore, they may be opposed to the idea of masculine and feminine and male and female altogether, as well as trans people, and therefore any usage of gendered language is counterproductive. But I think this supposes that the women's movement is transhistorical. It's not. In fact, feminism not being transhistorical is confined to a particular moment where there are certain social forces in play. And these forces are going to construct that legitimacy of gender that we feel. The reason that we feel that it is still an effective category is because it does have a real, albeit a virtual, presence in our culture. It has a certain amount of social capital and social sway that allows it to be successfully, continually used to uphold certain stereotypes and certain power relations. And that tangible carnal relation of bodies upon which power is dealt, and the resultant of which is our feeling of gender, that is something that grounds our feminist movement in a particular period where, although in the future we would like for gender to not exist, right now it does. Now, it doesn't exist in some essential manner, right? It has no validity outside of the value we give the concept socially. And yet, nevertheless, concepts carry a lot of weight. Think about things like personhood or the nation. These carry a lot of weight in our society and really help us to understand our psychology and our politics and our relationship to other people in the world. And gender is one of these concepts that unfortunately we have not yet supplanted. We have not yet surpassed it. And what the trans-exclusionary radical feminist tries to do, on my account, is it tries to sanitize the women's movement of difference. It says, you know what? Difference is a threat, and what we need to do is we need to maintain some essential kernel of our women's movement. But this is exactly the wrong way around. For, as Judith Butler puts it in Gender Trouble, Do the exclusionary practices that ground feminist theory in a notion of women as subject paradoxically undercut feminist goals to extend its claims to representation? In other words, if we suppose that there is some essential women as category that secures our feminist movement, we are by definition bound to exclude certain people from being represented. Our movement is based on exclusion, as trans-exclusionary radical feminism is. And I think exclusion is the wrong way around because it prevents us from making the historic progress away from the very tangible sway that gender does have right now to its eventual supplantation, right? Really, that is the counterproductive way to approach gender, is, instead of being essentialist about gender in the biological manner, we're essentialist about it from an ideological perspective, right? Because this is not a question of whether or not trans people exist in the sense of the psychological and physiological and social phenomena that lead people to have the sort of feelings that we classify as trans. That's not the question. The question is an ideological one of how do we filter the voices that are allowed into our movement? First off, who are we allowing to police this category of women, especially if we understand that women itself is a sort of nothing burger chimera that we make up? If that's the case, then we need not police this category at all. We should let it accrue difference. We should let it maintain its fluidity and its historicism. And in so doing, we will see it shift and dissipate such that eventually we will not need these concepts of gender anymore because we will have a more fluid understanding of sexuality and personal identity that does not allow us to restrict our identity to these essentially binary terms. Because, of course, trans people is not just trans women and trans men. Non-binary people would be in here too. So there's a whole can of difference that gets opened up here. And I see the trans-exclusionary approach as really preventing the radical feminist goals from being achieved on the grounds of some sort of ideological, praxis-oriented approach that is fundamentally essentialist, instead of taking a sort of pragmatist approach where we understand that, for example, I am of the opinion that everyone is gender fluid and queer in an important sense. And yet, I feel perfectly comfortable calling myself a man. Now, I understand the limitations of that, and I understand where the trans-exclusionary radical feminist is coming from in saying that, well, we want to get rid of gender, so why are you using gender categories? I am, in some large or small way, allying myself with a group of men, or at least, kind of putting myself in contiguity with this group of men that are misogynistic, androcentric, chauvinistic in ways that I am fundamentally opposed to. And yet I understand that pragmatically, this concept has enough weight that it can serve as a sort of point de capitaine, as Lacan would put it, a quilting point, a sort of localized way of pinning oneself down in a way that doesn't entirely preclude movement or change. It is just a sort of localized way of suspending this complexity that is humanity in suspended animation and allowing us to make changes around this point de capitaine. And in so doing, we will see gender slowly change. So instead of the trans-exclusionary radical feminist approach, I think that we can maintain the radical feminism while pragmatically staying sort of liminally okay with these concepts of gender insofar as they are just words. And they are tools, and eventually they will be surmounted and something will come in their place. And in so doing, we will see the occlusion of gender. So that being said, these are just a little bit of my ideas. I've talked about some of the other implications of kind of contemporary feminist theory on this channel, so feel free to peruse around and see some of my other thoughts. You can check out any of my stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature on this channel. You can also become a channel member if you'd like for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it helps me buy all the books necessary to read and then give y'all content. And I really appreciate everyone that does donate. That being said, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in another one.